Catherine Chen looked at herself in the mirror and smiled. Today was not a day for her usual power suit or designer clothes. Instead, she wore simple jeans, a plain sweater, and comfortable flats. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of the perfect style she usually wore for board meetings. She had even left her expensive watch and jewelry at home. Perfect, she thought. No one will recognize me today. Catherine had been the CEO of Meridian Financial Group for 5 years. Under her leadership, the company had grown from a small regional bank to one of the biggest financial institutions in the state. Just last month, they had bought a struggling bank chain with 10 branches across the city. The reports from those new branches weren't good. Customer complaints were high, and people were closing their accounts. But Catherine didn't just want to read reports. She wanted to see the problems with her own eyes. The best way to understand what's happening is to become a customer myself, she had told her assistant yesterday. No special treatment. No warnings to the branch. I want to see how they treat regular people. Her assistant had looked worried. Are you sure that's a good idea? What if someone recognizes you? Catherine had laughed. In those branches? Not likely. I've never visited them, and my picture isn't in their lobbies yet. She picked up the newspaper on her desk, which showed her accepting an award at a charity gala. Besides, between the fancy dress and professional makeup in these photos, no one will connect that person to a woman in jeans asking about a basic checking account. Now, as she drove to the downtown branch, Catherine felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This kind of undercover boss move wasn't something she had done before, but she believed in understanding problems from the ground up. The downtown branch was housed in an old brick building that needed some fresh paint and repairs. Catherine made a mental note as she pushed through the heavy glass doors. Inside, the bank was busy with lunchtime customers. People stood in line, some checking their watches and shifting impatiently from foot to foot. Catherine took her place in line and observed. The tellers didn't look up much. They processed transactions quickly but without smiles. One older teller kept sighing loudly every time a customer had a question. A young mother struggled with a stroller while trying to fill out a deposit slip, but none of the employees offered to help. Next, please. Catherine stepped forward to the teller window. The man behind the counter looked to be in his 30s, with a name tag that read Greg. He didn't look up from his computer as Catherine approached. "How can I help you?" he asked in a flat voice, still staring at his screen. "I'd like to make a deposit and also ask about your savings account options," Catherine said, sliding her deposit slip across the counter. Greg took the slip and typed the information into his computer. His fingers moved quickly, like he'd done this thousands of times before. He still hadn't looked at her face. "ID, please," he said. Catherine handed over her driver's license. Greg glanced at it briefly, then back at his screen. "The deposit will be available tomorrow," he said, pushing a receipt toward her. "Thank you," Catherine said. "And could you tell me about your savings options?" "I'm thinking about opening a new account." For the first time, Greg looked up at her. His eyes quickly took in her simple clothes and lack of jewelry. Something in his expression changed, a subtle shift that Catherine immediately recognized. She'd seen it many times in her life before she became successful, that look that said she wasn't worth much time or effort. "We have a basic savings account that might be suitable for you," Greg said, his tone changing to one you might use with a child. "It requires just a $25 minimum deposit." He slid a simple brochure across the counter. Catherine nodded, noticing how he'd automatically directed her to the most basic option without asking about her needs or finances. She wondered what kind of accounts he would recommend if she were wearing her designer suit and diamond earrings. "Do you have any premium options?" she asked, keeping her voice casual. Greg's eyebrows raised slightly. "We do, but those require minimum balances of $5,000 or more. They're designed for different financial situations." The way he emphasized different made his meaning clear. Catherine just smiled and took the brochure. This was exactly the kind of interaction she needed to see. And Greg had no idea that the woman he was dismissing could buy this entire branch with her personal funds if she wanted to. "Thank you for your help," she said quietly. "I'll definitely be back." Catherine stood at Greg's window, holding the basic account brochure he had dismissively handed her. She wasn't ready to walk away just yet. 20 years in the banking industry had taught her that sometimes you needed to dig a little deeper to see someone's true colors. Actually, Catherine said, pulling out a notepad from her purse, I have a few questions about these accounts if you don't mind. Greg glanced at the growing line behind her and then at the clock on the wall. He made no effort to hide his annoyance. Ma'am, there are other customers waiting, he said, his voice slightly louder than necessary. Maybe you could call a helpline instead. He slid a business card with the customer service number across the counter. Catherine noticed how he called her ma'am, not in a respectful way, but in that tone people use when they really want to say something much ruder. She'd heard that tone many times in her early career. I understand you're busy, Catherine said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but I'm already here, and these are quick questions. Your website mentions a special rate for new premium accounts. Is that offer still available? Greg sighed heavily and began tapping his pen on the counter. Like I said before, our premium accounts require significant deposits. They come with certain qualifications. He looked pointedly at her simple clothing. Our basic savings option is probably more suitable for your needs. A woman at the next window looked over, clearly uncomfortable with how Greg was speaking. Her teller was treating her much differently, probably because she was wearing an expensive-looking suit. I see, Catherine said calmly, making a small note in her notepad. And what if I wanted to discuss a business loan? Who would I speak with about that? This time, Greg couldn't contain a short, dismissive laugh. Business loans start at $50,000 and require extensive documentation and qualifications. He looked her up and down once more. I really don't think that would be a good use of anyone's time right now. An older man in line behind Catherine shifted uncomfortably. He'd clearly overheard Greg's comments and seemed embarrassed by them. Catherine wrote something else in her notepad, which seemed to make Greg nervous for the first time. What are you writing? He asked, his tone suddenly less confident. Oh, just making notes about the services offered, Catherine replied pleasantly. One more question. Does this branch have a private banking officer on site? We do, but he only meets with clients by appointment, and his services are for customers with portfolios over $1 million, Greg said, emphasizing the amount as if it were an impossible sum. Now, if there's nothing else, I really need to help the next customer. He was already looking past her, raising his hand to signal the next person in line. Catherine noticed he didn't ask if she wanted to open the basic account he'd suggested. He'd already decided she wasn't worth the paperwork. Thank you for your time, Catherine said, tucking her notepad away. Instead of leaving, though, she stepped to the side and approached the customer service desk, where a young woman named Tina was sorting through some files. Excuse me, Catherine said. I'd like to speak with the branch manager, please. Tina looked up, startled. Is there a problem with your transaction, ma'am? Not exactly, Catherine replied. I'd just like to discuss some aspects of your customer service approach. Tina's eyes darted nervously toward Greg, who was now helping an elderly gentleman but still watching Catherine suspiciously. Let me see if Mrs. Patel is available, Tina said, picking up the phone. May I tell her what this is regarding? Just tell her a customer would like to discuss the branch's approach to service quality, Catherine said, taking a seat in the small waiting area near the desk. Greg was now openly staring at her between customers, his expression a mix of annoyance and unease. He leaned over to whisper something to the teller at the next window, who then looked over at Catherine with curiosity. Catherine simply smiled and waited, mentally preparing for the next phase of her undercover visit. In her 20 years in banking, she'd learned that sometimes the most revealing moments came not from the first impression, but from how people handled being challenged. And she was very, very good at challenging people who underestimated her. From her seat, she could see Greg still watching her nervously. He had no idea what was coming next. Catherine sat patiently in the waiting area, watching the bank's operations with keen eyes. She noticed how some customers were guided immediately to private offices, while others were left standing in line. She took mental notes on everything: the worn carpet, the outdated brochures, the lack of water or coffee for waiting customers. All things she would address once her identity was known. After about 10 minutes, a woman in her mid-40s approached. She wore a navy blue suit and had her hair pulled back in a tight bun. A name badge identified her as Mrs. Patel, Assistant Branch Manager. I understand you wanted to speak with someone about our customer service. Mrs. Patel asked, her tone professional but slightly defensive. She didn't offer to shake hands or invite Catherine to a more private area. Yes, I would, Catherine replied, standing up. Is there somewhere we could talk more privately? Mrs. Patel glanced around the busy lobby. We can use the small conference room if it's really necessary, she said with obvious reluctance. I think it would be best, Catherine said firmly. With a small sigh, Mrs. Patel led Catherine to a small room near the back of the branch. The conference room had a round table with 4 chairs and walls that needed a fresh coat of paint. A coffee stain marked one corner of the table. Now, how can I help you? Mrs. Patel asked once they were seated. She didn't take out a notepad or seem prepared to record any concerns. I just had an interesting experience with one of your tellers, Catherine began. Greg, I believe his name was. Greg is one of our most efficient tellers, Mrs. Patel said quickly, already on the defensive. He processes more transactions than anyone else in the branch. I'm sure he does, Catherine nodded. But I noticed that his approach varies significantly depending on how customers are dressed or how they look. Mrs. Patel's expression tightened. I'm not sure what you mean. When I asked about premium accounts, he immediately directed me to your most basic option without asking about my financial situation, Catherine explained. He made it clear he was judging me based on my appearance. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding, Mrs. Patel said with a practiced smile. Greg was probably just trying to be helpful by suggesting an account that wouldn't burden you with high minimum balance requirements. Catherine tilted her head slightly. So you're saying it's helpful to assume someone can't afford better services based on how they're dressed? Mrs. Patel's smile faltered. No, of course not, but our tellers see hundreds of customers every day. They become good at assessing which products would be most suitable. Interesting, Catherine said, taking out her notepad. So it's branch policy to assess customers by their appearance rather than by asking about their needs or financial situation. That's not what Mrs. Patel stopped herself. Look, I apologize if Greg wasn't as attentive as he should have been. We're very busy, especially around lunch hour. Being busy isn't an excuse for poor service, Catherine said calmly. I also noticed that Greg tried to discourage me from asking questions by pointing out the line behind me. Is rushing customers also part of your efficiency metrics? Mrs. Patel shifted uncomfortably in her seat. For the first time, she seemed to be really looking at Catherine, as if trying to place her face. Have we met before? She asked suddenly. I don't believe so, Catherine replied truthfully. They had been on a video conference call once, but Mrs. Patel had been one of 30 branch managers on the call, and Catherine's video had been professionally lit and staged. You seem very knowledgeable about banking practices, Mrs. Patel said cautiously. I've been in the industry a while, Catherine said with a slight smile. Now, I'd also like to know about your staff training programs. How often do you conduct customer service refreshers? We follow the schedule set by head office, Mrs. Patel answered vaguely. Every quarter or so. And who oversees that training? Do you personally participate? The questions were becoming more specific, more pointed, and Mrs. Patel was growing increasingly uncomfortable. She glanced at her watch. I'm sorry, but I have a meeting in a few minutes. Maybe you'd like to fill out a customer feedback form instead. She reached for a paper form on a nearby shelf. Actually, Catherine said, closing her notepad, I'd prefer to speak with the branch manager directly. Is Mr. Rivera available? Mrs. Patel's eyes widened slightly at Catherine's knowledge of the manager's name. How did you know? She was interrupted by a knock at the door. A tall man in his 50s poked his head in. Sorry to interrupt, Linda, but... He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on Catherine. The color drained from his face as recognition dawned. Ms. Chen, I had no idea you were visiting today, he stammered. And just like that, Catherine's cover was blown. The small conference room suddenly felt even smaller. Mr. Rivera stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock as he stared at Catherine. Mrs. Patel looked back and forth between them, confusion spreading across her face. Ms. Chen, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. As in, Catherine Chen? The CEO. Catherine smiled slightly and extended her hand to Mr. Rivera. "Hello, David. It's nice to finally meet you in person." Mr. Rivera stepped forward and shook her hand, looking like he might faint. We had no idea you were coming today." "There was nothing on the schedule." "That was intentional," Catherine explained calmly. "I wanted to experience the branch as a regular customer would." Mrs. Patel's face had turned a ghostly shade of white. "Oh my goodness, all those questions. I didn't realize." She smoothed her jacket nervously, as if trying to make herself more presentable. "Please, both of you, sit down," Catherine said, gesturing to the chairs. "This isn't a firing squad." They sat stiffly, exchanging nervous glances. Through the conference room's glass window, Catherine could see curious employees looking their way. Word was spreading quickly. At his telewindow, Greg was leaning forward, trying to see what was happening. "I'd like to continue our discussion," Catherine said, "but first, maybe we should close the blinds." "I think we're becoming a spectacle." Mr. Rivera jumped up and quickly closed the blinds on the conference room windows, blocking the curious stares from the main floor. As he did, Catherine could see Greg watching intently, his expression changing from curiosity to concern as he recognized her from their earlier interaction. "Ms. Chen, I want to personally apologize for any negative experience you had today," Mr. Rivera began once he was seated again. "If I had known." Catherine held up her hand. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it? If you had known who I was, I would have received different treatment. But shouldn't every customer receive good service, regardless of who they are or what they're wearing?" Mrs. Patel stared at the table, unable to meet Catherine's eyes. Mr. Rivera nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right," he said. "There's no excuse." A knock on the door interrupted them. A young employee peeked in, looking terrified. "I'm so sorry to interrupt, but, there's a bit of a situation on the floor. People are whispering about the CEO being here, and some customers are asking questions, and Greg is, well, he's not taking it well." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The employee swallowed hard. "He's saying it couldn't possibly be true because he just helped you and you were, The young woman trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "I was what?" Catherine asked, though she could guess what Greg had said. "He said you didn't look like someone important," the employee finished quietly. Mr. Rivera closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain. "Thank you, Lucy. Please tell everyone to continue helping customers as normal. We'll address this shortly." After Lucy left, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Catherine opened her notepad and wrote something down. "You're taking notes?" Mrs. Patel asked nervously. "I've been taking notes all day," Catherine replied. "About the physical condition of the branch, the customer flow, the service quality. And now I'm noting that even after learning my identity, your teller is still making judgments based on appearances." Mr. Rivera looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. "Ms. Chen, I assure you, this is not representative of how we want to run this branch." "And yet it is how the branch is being run," Catherine pointed out. "I visited 3 other branches this week in the same casual clothing. Only at this location was I treated with such obvious disdain." Mrs. Patel finally found her voice. Will there be terminations?" Her voice trembled slightly. Catherine considered the question. Through the closed blinds, she could hear the hushed, anxious buzz of the main floor. Everyone out there was probably wondering the same thing. "My goal isn't to fire people, Mrs. Patel. It's to fix problems." She closed her notepad. "But first, I think it's time to have a conversation with everyone, don't you? Including Greg." Mr. Rivera nodded and stood up. "I'll gather everyone in the break room. We can close the branch for 30 minutes. As he headed for the door, Catherine stopped him with a question. "David, does this branch have security cameras with audio?" "Yes, in all public areas," he confirmed. "Good," Catherine said. "I'd like to review today's footage during our discussion. Sometimes people need to see themselves through others' eyes to understand the impact of their behavior." The look of dread on both managers' faces told her volumes about what those tapes would reveal. The break room was too small for all 15 employees, but no one dared to complain as they squeezed in. Some sat on chairs while others leaned against walls or perched on countertops. The room buzzed with nervous whispers that stopped instantly when Catherine walked in with Mr. Rivera and Mrs. Patel. Greg stood in the back corner, arms crossed defensively across his chest. His face was pale, but his expression was stubborn. He had changed from dismissive to defiant, which Catherine found interesting. Some people responded to mistakes with humility. Others doubled down. "Thank you all for gathering here," Catherine said, looking around the room. "For those who haven't figured it out yet, I'm Catherine Chen, CEO of Meridian Financial Group." A few gasps came from employees who hadn't heard the news yet. One young teller whispered, "No way," before being shushed by a colleague. "I visited your branch today as a regular customer to see firsthand how our clients are treated," Catherine continued. "I've been doing this at several of our locations since the merger." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Catherine noticed how some employees couldn't meet her eyes, while others looked genuinely concerned. "I want to make something clear," she said, her voice firm but not angry. "I'm not here to fire everyone. I'm here to fix problems." A collective breath of relief swept through the room, though Greg remained stiff and unmoving in his corner. "Mr. Rivera has set up the security footage from my visit today," Catherine said, turning to the small TV mounted on the break room wall. "I think it's important we all watch it together." Mr. Rivera pressed play, and there on screen was Catherine approaching Greg's window. The audio wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to hear their entire interaction. Many employees winced as they heard Greg's condescending tone and saw his dismissive gestures. When the video ended, Catherine turned back to the room. "What I experienced today wasn't just poor customer service. It was judgment based on appearance. And from what I observed, I wasn't the only one treated this way." Mrs. Patel stared at her shoes. Mr. Rivera looked genuinely distressed. "The customer waiting behind me was an older gentleman in work clothes. He was directed to your most basic checking account, too," Catherine noted. "But the woman in the designer suit who came in after him was immediately offered information about premium services and investment options." Several employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't news to them. "Here's what concerns me most," Catherine continued. "None of you seem surprised by what you just saw, which tells me this isn't unusual behavior here." The silence in the room confirmed her suspicion. A young woman in the front tentatively raised her hand. "Ms. Chen, I've only been here 3 months, but we were told that part of efficiency is customer sorting, directing people to appropriate services quickly." "Customer sorting?" Catherine repeated. "Yes, we were trained to assess customers quickly by their appearance and manner to determine which products to offer them," the young woman explained nervously. "To save time." Catherine turned to Mr. Rivera. "Is this true?" He shifted uncomfortably. "It's not official policy, but yes, we do encourage staff to make quick assessments to streamline service." "And these quick assessments are based on what? Clothing, jewelry, accent?" Catherine asked. No one answered. They didn't need to. Catherine set her notepad on a table. "Let me tell you about my background. I grew up in a small apartment above my parents' grocery store. I wore second-hand clothes until I was in college. When I got my first banking job, I was told I didn't look the part and should consider being a teller instead of applying for the management training program." The room was completely silent now. "If someone had sorted me based on my appearance back then, I wouldn't be standing here today as your CEO," Catherine said quietly. "And how many of our customers are we failing right now because of these assumptions?" Greg finally spoke from his corner. "With all due respect, Ms. Chen, we're just doing our jobs efficiently. We can't spend 20 minutes with every customer discussing premium services they can't afford." Catherine turned to face him directly. "And how exactly do you determine what someone can afford, Greg?" "My net worth is over 8 figures, but you decided I belonged in the basic account category within seconds." Greg's face flushed red. "This isn't about embarrassing anyone," Catherine said, addressing the whole room again. "It's about recognizing that we're failing our customers and our company with these practices. And starting today, that changes." 1 week after Catherine's surprise visit, the downtown branch looked completely different. Gone were the outdated brochures and worn carpet. Fresh paint brightened the walls, and a small coffee station welcomed customers in the waiting area. But the biggest changes weren't the physical ones. Catherine had made good on her promise. Instead of firing everyone, she had launched what she called a branch reset. Every employee, from Mr. Rivera down to the newest teller, was going through intensive customer service training. And to everyone's surprise, Catherine herself led several of the sessions. "I want you to pair up," Catherine instructed during one afternoon session. The entire branch staff had gathered in a hotel conference room near their office. "One of you will play a customer who doesn't fit the wealthy stereotype. Maybe you're in work clothes or casual dress. The other will be the bank employee." Greg sat in the back row, still quiet and somewhat sullen. He hadn't been fired, which had surprised everyone, but he'd been placed on what Catherine called a growth plan. He was paired with Lucy, the young employee who had interrupted the meeting last week. "Now," Catherine continued, "I want the customers to ask about premium services or loans. And I want the employees to practice responding without making assumptions." As the pairs began their role-playing exercise, Catherine walked around the room, listening and occasionally offering guidance. When she reached Greg and Lucy, she paused to watch their interaction. Lucy was playing a construction worker interested in investment options. Greg's responses were technically correct, but still had an edge to them. "You're doing better, Greg," Catherine said quietly, so only he could hear. "But you're still speaking down to her. Try again. But this time, imagine she's the wealthiest customer you've ever had." Greg's face reddened, but he nodded and started over. This time, his tone changed noticeably. He became more attentive, more respectful. "That's it," Catherine encouraged. "Every customer deserves that level of service." After the exercise finished, Catherine gathered everyone together again. "You might be wondering why I'm personally involved in this training. Why doesn't the CEO have better things to do?" Several people nodded. It was unusual, to say the least. "Because this branch is going to become our model for the entire company," Catherine announced. "What we learn here, what we fix here, will roll out everywhere." Mr. Rivera looked stunned. "But we were the problem branch. The one with complaints." "Exactly," Catherine smiled. "Which means you have the most room for improvement. And sometimes the places with the biggest problems become the best success stories." Back at the branch the next day, the training was put to the test. Catherine had arranged for mystery shoppers, people who would come in pretending to be customers but would actually be evaluating the service. The first was an elderly woman in simple clothes who asked about retirement accounts. Then came a young man with tattoos and ripped jeans inquiring about business loans. Later, a woman in a cleaning uniform wanted information about college savings plans for her children. Greg was tested the most, with 4 different mystery shoppers visiting his window. To everyone's surprise, including his own, he passed each test. It wasn't perfect. His smile sometimes looked forced, but he gave each person his full attention and offered the same range of options regardless of appearance. At the end of the day, Catherine gathered everyone again. "Today was just the beginning," she said. "The real test will be making these changes permanent." She unveiled a new set of guidelines that would be implemented across all branches. Customer satisfaction would now be measured through detailed surveys rather than just transaction speed. Employee bonuses would be tied to these satisfaction scores rather than to how many premium accounts they opened. "We're also creating a new position," Catherine announced. "Each branch will have a customer experience officer who reports directly to me, bypassing normal management channels." Mrs. Patel raised her hand hesitantly. "And who will be taking that role here?" Catherine smiled. "I've been watching everyone closely this week, and I've decided that Lucy will be our first customer experience officer." Lucy's eyes widened in shock. "Me, but I'm the newest person here." "Sometimes fresh eyes see the problems most clearly," Catherine explained. "You were the only one who spoke up about the customer sorting practice during our first meeting. That took courage." As the meeting ended, Greg approached Catherine privately. "Ms. Chen, can I speak with you for a moment?" Catherine nodded, curious about what he might say. "I've been thinking a lot this week," Greg said, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I was wrong about you, and probably wrong about a lot of other customers too. I just wanted to say, I'm actually grateful you came in that day." Catherine studied him for a moment, then smiled. "The hardest lessons are often the most valuable ones, Greg. We're all learning here. 3 months had passed since Catherine's undercover visit to the downtown branch. The early morning sun streamed through the newly cleaned windows as she parked her car in a lot. This time, she wasn't dressed in jeans and a simple sweater. Today, she wore a professional navy suit. She wasn't here to test anyone, just to see the results of all their hard work. As Catherine walked through the front doors, she immediately noticed the difference. The lobby had a warm, welcoming feel. A young man greeted customers as they entered, asking if they needed help finding services. The line moved efficiently, but no one seemed rushed. Employees made eye contact with customers and smiled genuinely. Catherine stood back, observing for a few minutes without announcing herself. She watched as an elderly gentleman in work clothes approached a teller window, Greg's window. Her interest piqued. Catherine moved closer to hear their interaction. "Good morning, sir," Greg said with a smile that reached his eyes. "How can I help you today?" The elderly man explained that he needed to deposit his social security check and was wondering if there was a way to avoid the long line next time. "Absolutely," Greg replied. "Let me tell you about a few options that might work well for you." He proceeded to explain direct deposit, mobile banking, and even mentioned the premium checking account that would give the man additional services. Catherine smiled to herself. The change in Greg was remarkable. He was thorough, patient, and most importantly, treating the elderly customer with genuine respect. When Greg finished helping the man, he looked up and noticed Catherine. This time, there was no panic or embarrassment in his expression, just a surprised smile. "Ms. Chen, nice to see you again," he said, his tone professional but warm. "Hello, Greg. That was excellent service you just provided," Catherine said. Greg nodded appreciatively. "Thank you. I've learned a lot these past few months." Lucy, now 3 months into her role as Customer Experience Officer, spotted Catherine from across the lobby and hurried over. "Ms. Chen, we weren't expecting you today," she said, excited rather than nervous. "I have so much to show you." Lucy proudly walked Catherine through the branch, pointing out all the changes they'd implemented. New signs clearly explained services without banking jargon. A dedicated area had been set up where customers could get one-on-one help with online banking. Even the break room had been transformed into a training center where employees regularly practiced customer interactions. "Our customer satisfaction scores have gone up by 47% since your visit," Lucy reported enthusiastically. "And we've actually seen a 23% increase in premium account openings." "How did that happen?" Catherine asked, genuinely curious. "Turns out, when we stopped making assumptions about people, we discovered many customers qualified for better services than we were offering them," Lucy explained. "We were leaving money on the table with our old approach." Mr. Rivera joined them, looking more relaxed and confident than he had during Catherine's last visit. "It's been quite a journey, Ms. Chen. The team has really embraced the changes." "And Greg?" Catherine asked quietly. "How's he doing with everything?" "See for yourself," Mr. Rivera said, gesturing toward the lobby. Catherine looked over to see Greg helping a young woman in paint-splattered overalls. He was showing her investment options on a tablet, giving her his complete attention. "He's become one of our top performers," Lucy said, "not by rushing customers, but by really listening to them. Last week, he helped that same painter open a business account for her new contracting company. Turns out she's quite successful." Catherine nodded, not surprised. Sometimes people just need someone to see their potential. Later that afternoon, Catherine gathered the entire branch staff together. The atmosphere was completely different from 3 months ago, relaxed, proud, even excited. "When I visited this branch undercover, I saw problems that needed fixing," Catherine told the group. "But what I see today is nothing short of transformation." She revealed that the downtown branch, once the worst-performing location in their network, was now in the top 3 for both customer satisfaction and new account openings. "Your success isn't just about numbers," Catherine continued. "It's about creating a place where every customer feels valued, regardless of appearance or background." Greg spoke up from the back of the room. "Ms. Chen, I have to ask, why didn't you fire me that day? Most CEOs would have." Catherine smiled thoughtfully. "Because firing people is easy. Changing a culture is hard." And we needed to change the culture, not just remove one person. She looked around at all their faces. The lesson wasn't just for you, Greg. It was for all of us. Success isn't about judging books by their covers. It's about giving every person who walks through those doors the same opportunity to thrive. As Catherine left the branch that day, she glanced back at the building. What had started as an uncomfortable undercover visit had turned into something much more valuable. A reminder that sometimes the most difficult conversations lead to the most meaningful changes.